Welcome to Talent Titans, the podcast where we bring you entrepreneurs and leaders from the global staffing industry. I'm your host, Suky Sodhi. Now let's jump right on in and welcome today's Titan.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Talent Titans. My topic today, in many ways, is kind of boring: insurance. However, it is such a vital topic, and it's like everything else, like your car insurance, your life insurance. When you need it, that's where it pays dividends. So, who better to talk about that? Matt Calvin from ProLink. Matt, welcome.
Thank you so much, Suki. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Thank you for joining us. And did you like how I said it? Insurance is boring, no
Oh my gosh.
disrespect.
Is it ever? And I've been doing this for 20 years, so I can appreciate that. Insurance is not, it's not a topic that is everyone's favorite discussion point. A lot of folks view it as being a little shady, maybe a little expensive, but, it really does serve a purpose. And I'm looking forward to getting more into the details on that with you today.
100% car insurance. Like, I hate paying it, especially when my boys were younger. I paid $1,000 a month to have the boys
Yeah.
on car insurance. We never, thank God we never had to use it, but
hmm
that one time somebody has to use it, you're going to be glad you paid the $1,000 a month, right?
That's just it. Yes, and I think like home auto, it's a necessary evil for us to live our lives today. You can't get a mortgage without insurance. You can't buy a car without insurance. So, they are quote unquote necessary evils.
Yeah. I want to talk about staffing and insurance in particular. As you know, I deal with a lot of, or all my clients are staffing agencies, one way, shape, form, or another. And when I'm, especially on the coaching side, when I'm talking to them and I'm talking about insurance, they're just like,
Hmm.
because especially in a startup, right? They have limited cash, they may be self-funding and things like that. So let's talk about insurance for staffing agency. I want to talk about both perm, search, retain, doesn't matter. I want to talk all things insurance staffing.
Love it. No, that's great. So yeah, I guess what I'll start off with, maybe just to give our listeners a little bit of detail. My name is Matt Calvin, and I manage the largest staffing program in Canada, which, I wear as a very much a badge of honor. But with that comes a lot of knowledge and expertise on the risks that our industry faces. And, not all those risks are insurable, but certainly a lot of what our listeners do day to day can be insured. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit, very high level, about, some of the products that our listeners should be considering if they're starting up a new business, or maybe they've been in the business for quite some time, but just unsure of what it is that they should have to effectively protect their assets, protect their reputation, and then protect just their business resilience. So,
Yeah. Actually,
you know,
before you go on, let me just quickly interject. I should have said this and I apologize. We have a lot of international listeners. We are going to be talking predominantly Canada.
right.
However, a lot of this is going to apply to you wherever you are. So, for example, professional indemnity, doesn't matter where you are, you need that. So I should have said that and I apologize. And almost what I want to do is for those people that are already insured, Matt, I almost want to give them an audit in their mind, right? So if we can make sure we
Definitely.
kind of do that as well, that'll be great. So back over to you. Sorry about that.
No, that's great, Suki, and you're absolutely right. This is a topic that is going to translate regardless of where you are geographically. Be it in the UK, you can buy a professional indemnity policy. In the US, you can buy a professional liability policy. And that's the other thing. We oftentimes, especially as brokers and insurance folks, we get caught up a little bit in the jargon and the terminology. And so, just to let our listeners know, errors and omissions insurance is the same as professional liability insurance, is the same as is professional indemnity insurance. So, I think going in and recognizing that who you're engaging with when managing your insurance, they could be using different terminology, but when you break it down very simply, professional liability insurance is your errors and omissions. A professional liability policy is really intended to protect you and your company and the folks that work for your company for any liabilities that arise from any third parties. So think customers, think your candidates, anyone who's using your services. If they feel that they were given bad advice or a mistake that was made in the course of them doing their work for you, there's a good chance that you could potentially be sued for any financial damages that that affected client or customer or candidate might incur as a result of an alleged failure. And let me just sort of point out why that's important. It doesn't always have to be a definitive circumstance where you were fully in the wrong. It could be allegations. It could be totally frivolous, but yet you're still obligated to defend. And that's really the intent of a professional liability policy, is to give you as a company the protection to respond to these types of claims.
You're so right, because if you just think about everything, just turn on the news, we've become a sue first, ask questions later,
You got
right?
it.
And
Totally.
and it's sad that we've become that, because there's a lot of amazing businesses out there that have had to fight these cases, these unwarranted accusations and stuff like that, and they have won. But
Hmm.
whilst you're fighting that, you're not looking after your business, right? So
Totally.
we need to make sure. I want everybody to be listening to this and saying, okay, I'm going to go and check, am I covered
Yeah.
correctly?
You got it correctly. And that's where engaging with your agent or broker is paramount. Because, I think we all can agree here, myself included, to go through your 60-page policy is daunting. I mean, it's enough to put you to sleep. And so, it's really important to rely on your insurance professional to help really guide you through those wordings to make sure you fully understand what you have coverage for and what you don't. I think there's a misconception sometimes out in the industry where people are buying a policy expecting that it's going to cover them for everything, and that's just not how it works, unfortunately. Your policy is governed by oftentimes what the exclusions are. So they're going to cover you for just about anything as long as it's not specifically excluded in your policy. So making sure that you have a really robust professional liability policy, again, I just can't stress the importance of that enough. And really, my advice would be talk to the person who sold you the policy, talk to the company, your broker, who really put this policy in place for you to make sure it's addressing those risks that you feel are enough to really hinder your business. And I understand we don't all have a crystal ball. We can't always predict the things that are going to happen in the future. But again, it's really worth making sure that you have a robust insurance program that is offering you the broadest coverage. Now,
Okay,
it,
so let me interject here.
yeah,
I call my broker, so I'm going to end up calling you because you are my
hi,
broker,
Suki.
right? I don't know what I don't know about professional
Right.
indemnity, right? So
Yeah.
can you give us an example of, look, 100%, again, bring it back to our industry. You
Hmm.
must have coverage for ABCD. Don't let them exclude XYZ. Can you just
Yep.
give us a little bit of a flavor? Because now I'm sitting here and I'm like, am I covered? Well, I have it.
Yeah.
I pay my premium, and you've just talked about exclusions, and so let's give them a flavor of, look, this is what as a minimum the kind of things your policy must have.
Definitely. So, speaking strictly for the professional
Yep.
liability, you want to make sure that your policy effectively covers you for your vetting, recruitment, It's going to cover you for any payroll services that you might do if you're into temp and contract work. And you want to make sure that you have limits no less than $1 million. Now, most companies nowadays aren't going to sell you a policy less than $1 million. And even now, the advice I would give to you, Suki, is if we're having that conversation, $1 million,
It's
when you
nothing.
think about lawyers' fees and if the court awards damages, that can be eroded very, very quickly. And so the advice I would give you is to consider maybe a 2 million or potentially even 5 if it is cost feasible for you. That's the other thing I think is really important, is to make sure you're buying a policy that fits within your budget. You can get very carried away with enhancements to the policy, which we'll talk about in a minute, because one of the things I want to really speak to is what we call employment practices liability insurance, which is, it is a separate type of coverage. But just to go back quickly to, what sort of consultation would I give to you if you're looking to make sure that I have an insurance program that really works for me? Professional liability. First and foremost, always. All of us here today are professionals, and people are relying on our experience and our professional service to make an educated decision, right? We're putting forward candidates that we've already vetted and we think are going to bolster our client. We think that this candidate is going to be right for the job that they're looking to hire. Well, that client's looking to us as the staffing company and the recruiter to make sure that we've done our due diligence to ensure this person has the proper background checks, that they're qualified for the job, they've got the right experience. And so that puts us in a situation where, again, someone's relying on us, that could cause financial disruption to the company. The other policy that's really important that you carry, and in fact, anytime you're going to engage with a client who has any sort of insurance requirements of you, is what we call commercial general liability insurance. This is a policy, regardless of whether you're staffing, you're manufacturing, you're running a little store, everyone's going to have a commercial general liability policy. And what that is third party bodily injury and property damage insurance. Now, you're probably thinking, look, I work in my office every day. I'm not going to the client site. Why would I ever, I'm not going to trip someone. I'm not going to break an expensive vase. I'm not going to burn down their building. No customer is likely going to let a candidate onto their premises without you confirming you've got this policy in place. Okay, that is the paramount policy you will always see in all customer contracts, is commercial general liability. Now, to drill that down a little further and why it's important that you want to make sure you have a robust general liability policy, is making sure that that policy is going to cover your workers on assignment. So let's talk. I want to talk about that for a minute, if we
Yeah, for
can.
sure.
Your candidate goes to work at a warehouse. Your client, even though the client technically has, the supervision of that individual, they're guiding them, they're telling so and so to please go do this for the next 3 hours. Maybe that involves working on a forklift. Now, I'm going to go back to a little bit on the professional liability. It's a little puzzle here, but we're going to wash it out in the end. You are doing your due diligence as the staffing company to make sure that that individual has the proper certification. Your customer is going to rely on you to make sure that that candidate has the right qualification, certification to operate that piece of machinery. So your candidate's working, he gets on the forklift, he drives accidentally into a shelving unit, the whole thing tips. Before you know it, in the blink of an eye, we're now into the thousands of dollars of damages. Okay, your client has sustained a significant loss. There's stock that's been knocked over, the shelving units might have been damaged, the building might have been damaged. It is a commercial general liability policy, is the one to defend your candidate and you in the event of that circumstance. So you can appreciate why it's important that even though we're sitting behind desks most of our days, that we're also responsible, sometimes contractually, for the work that's being done on the client site. Now, we could get into the nitty-gritty of contracts and, hold harmless agreements and indemnity agreements, but it's again not going to prevent that customer, that client from potentially looking to sue you. And again, this is a major point of having a robust insurance program, is to make sure that you're going to get defended by the insurance, that the cost of that defense is going to be picked up by your insurance. So again, it's so important to have those conversations with your insurance professional to make sure you're being properly protected there.
Okay, so here's what I heard. Here's what I heard. Doesn't matter whether you've done all your due diligence. So let's go back to your forklift truck driver.
Hmm.
We've seen his license, the original license, it's valid, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Hey, they've even gone on site and done a test. All great. They come and work on site. Now they've knocked a rack over, um, tens of hundred thousands potentially in losses. God forbid they drove over someone's toe.
Hmm.
So then there comes that human part of it. Logic tells me your premises, your insurance. But what we're saying here is they're not going to want to claim on their insurance. They're going to want to try and claim on yours. Is that
You
in
got
essence what
it.
we've just said?
Pretty well. I mean, why would you? If you Let's put myself in the client's shoes for a moment. If I'm hiring a group of workers and, I'm asking for my vendor, the staffing company, to have insurance, I'm almost relying on them to be the responsible party. Now, again, topic for another day, but we can get into a conversation around, contractual liability and how can we effectively as a staffing company try to pass that liability back onto our client. But for all intents and purposes, that customer is likely going to look at the vendor, the supplier who provided them with the labor. That labor caused them a loss. Why would they want to put that through their own insurance and get dinged potentially with higher premiums at renewal because they've put through a claim on their own insurance? So, what they're trying to focus on is how can I not have to claim my own insurance? How can I pass this on to someone else?
And as you were talking, the thought going through my head was, now I don't do light industrial temp or anything like that, but that's where I originally started. And I'm thinking if I was doing that today, I just make sure I'm covered because that may cost me $1,000, may cost me
Yeah.
$2,000 a year. I don't know what it is, right? So I'm just making up those numbers. But if I don't have that, client's likely going to use my competitor, and I'm losing tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars on the other end by not having that. Yet we could argue, yes, pass the liability on contract. No, that makes sense. Unfortunately, yet again, it's an insurance that we're only going to be paying out on until we need it.
Ain't that the case?
Yeah,
Yeah, you're right. It really is. And I think for a lot of folks, because, let's face it, a lot of us here are running really well established businesses. We act very ethically, we're always above board. And many of us, maybe have never had a claim in the many years that we've
knock
been
on wood.
operating our, yeah, knock
Yeah.
on wood. And so, there is a little bit of a sentiment, well, I'm paying all these premiums. I never have to use my insurance, but I think it's important to appreciate there's a sense of peace of mind there as well, and
And before I say this, I do not know anyone that has done this. So this is just another thought that came to my mind. You can't ask the temp to go and get insurance, right? So in
no,
self, quote unquote, self-insure, right? So let's be
correct.
clear here, because the other business head was saying, "Well, I wonder if if someone's going to be watching this and thinking, listening to this and thinking, well, I'll just get the temp to self-insure." No, that's not the answer.
Yeah, it's not the answer. You're absolutely right. And I think it also comes down to law
I was
and
just
the
going to say, would it
employment.
be illegal? Would it be
It, it,
legal?
not technically. I mean, so an employer by law has an obligation to bear the risk of their employees. And that goes for temp employees too.
Yeah.
There's not a distinguishing factor there in our Employment Standards Act that says, well, if this employee For all intents and purposes, we're the one who's tendering their T4 at the end of the year. They are our employee. Just because they're going to work at a third party client site does not negate that they're an employee.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Good point.
for an employee to go out and source their own insurance is going to be very difficult. It's because, again, many insurance applications are going to look to only insure you as a business. And you're technically not a business, you're conducting business on behalf of your employer. So it's really important to bear in mind that it's almost a false ask to go out to get your temporary employee to go buy their own insurance.
That
It'll be a
also falls under
painful,
misclassification, which we're going to talk about in
yeah,
a minute, right? So I think that'll tie into that one. But the other
definitely.
thing I've seen on my insurance policy that you've been recommending, and I just go, okay, sign this, you know how it goes, right? Was the
Yes.
cyber one. Now, when I first
Yes.
started my own business, like nearly 30 years ago, that
It
wasn't
wasn't
even
even a
something,
thing.
it wasn't even a thing. And
I know.
even 10 years ago, I don't think it was a thing. And now there's cybersecurity. What is that?
Oh my goodness. What
I
is
know I
that?
got it,
Yeah.
but what is it? What did I find?
Yeah, you know what? So the term cyber liability has really only been in the public realm for maybe the last 10, 15 years. When I first started 20 years ago in insurance, cyber liability as a product didn't even exist. So let's break it down in a couple of ways. Cyber liability is insurance that you take out to protect your business for any potential privacy infringements or data breaches that occur on your network. But let's also remember it can take place in paper form. So a business that who's been in business for as long as you have, Suki, you might still have old paper files kicking in a shelving unit behind you. That also constitutes cyber liability. There could be personal information on that paper that, if for whatever reason it got leaked, could have an impact on a group of people who their public information is potentially out in the public realm. Now, it's 2025. Most of that is all done on computers now. But a lot of times when I'm having these conversations around cyber liability with our clients is, well, we're on a cloud provider, so we don't really have a risk. And all I can say to that, to put it bluntly, is no, you're wrong. So, we're all using nowadays a lot of cloud providers, ATS platforms that house that data. But if you were ever look at the fine print of those contracts that you sign, those cloud providers are going to absolve themselves of any liability. That's not to say they're totally off the hook. If they experience a data breach, they have a lot of their own clients to answer to, yourself included. But let's not forget, who is the one who's populating that cloud service? Who's the one who's inputting that personal information? It would be you as the staffing company. You're meeting with the candidate, you're getting, their, mostly it's name, address, phone number. But, if you're getting into temp and contract work where you may be doing the
Payment
payrollings,
details.
you
Yeah.
got a void check on hand. Do you have a driver's license on hand? Do you have, you know, any other sensitive information? Maybe you have a little bit of background into health issues that this candidate has had. So before you know it, you've got a lot of really sensitive information that you've collected from this individual. You've, put it into your system, and, it's now sitting in the cloud. You have access to that. Well, if ever a data breach occurred, it takes nothing for those affected individuals to say, hey, I gave you my information. I don't care where you kept it. It doesn't matter because now my personal information is breached and I'm going to sue you. And so this is why cyber liability is so important, and also to appreciate that no one is off the hook from a cyber risk. So when you're buying cyber liability, you're buying it to protect your network. It's not unusual that you're going to see in insurance or in contracts with your clients that they're going to ask you to have cyber liability insurance. It's not unusual, but what I can say on that is the client could be asking for it from a couple of different angles. One is they either think that your cyber insurance is going to protect any losses that occur on their system, which is not the case, but it's giving your customer assurance that you have the proper protections to make sure that if any breach occurs on your system, they don't get implicated. You have means of addressing that by way of an insurance policy.
I think, and this is just pure coincidence. We had an internal meeting about a month ago. Less than that, it was after the summit. And we literally, that's exactly what we talked about. Where's our liability from a tech perspective? What are we doing about it? And an audit, right?
Yep.
And then literally every year, I will look at the paperwork. And this weekend, Staples, they have that secure destruction service, right? Literally cost me not like $150. It wasn't expensive. Literally just make sure it is destroyed in a secure manner.
Definitely. Yes. And in fact, if you look at even our application, it asks one of the questions when trying to apply for cyber insurance, do you dispose of physical documents? I can't remember the way it's worded, but are you disposing of it where it's effectively destroyed? The document is destroyed. And yes, that's exactly what we should be doing. If you're looking, if you've been in business or you've been operating with paper files, and you're considering making that transition of getting everything put onto an electronic system, after you scan those documents into a shredder, or bring them to Staples, bring them to, a place that can very securely get rid of those documents. You don't just throw them in the trash because it takes no effort for someone to go dumpster diving and find a whole heap of records that, could have some very sensitive information on people.
100%. But I think it's also like pretty much all our stuff is automated. But but I've just kept even financials, right? So
Hmm.
forget people's security stuff, the financials, the invoices, and things like that. I kind of just kept them. Now every year I go back, whatever is 8 years old,
Hmm.
I go to Staples, right? So phasing that out. So
Yeah.
I think I've got another year. I think got another year's worth that I can't destroy yet. But once that's gone, we will be paperless in that sense. But candidates will bring in their CVs, and as recruiters, we print the candidate's CV off because I'm old school. It's easier for me to read. So even
Sure.
that has to go straight into a shredder,
Yep.
right?
You
So
got it.
we don't think about it. We think, oh no, we don't take people's driving license. We don't take a copy of their passport. Something as simple as their CV, which has their phone number, their home address on it.
That's it. And it's got a record of where they've worked.
Yeah,
So, like people are crafty, and who knows what hands that information may land in. So let's be very, very cautious, and let's do our best to protect those individuals, and to your point, scrap these documents. The other thing too is, if you've been operating on an ATS for some time, doing a purge maybe every few
yeah,
years and
we're
getting
doing
rid
that.
of old candidate files, because that's the other thing. The more you build on your database, the more risk you're at. You've gone from having potentially, 150 candidate files. Fast forward 3 years, you could have 2,000 or more. And so you're adding to your risk profile by growing your business. I know it sounds,
No, but
kind of
you make a
counterintuitive.
really good point because part of this is what we're talking about. The ATS, and my ops guy we had a date, right? And they were like, anything prior to that, zero contact, blah 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 blah. Because right, he was like, purge, get rid.
Yep.
But my business head was, oh my god, how many records is that going to be? Right. So
Believe it, and it's going to be so many more than you ever thought.
I know, and his answer to me was, well, when's the last time you do you even know where that person is today? I'm like, well, we can
Right?
find out. So it's a really interesting one. So of course, it was the audit, so we're going with his way. But for me, I'd never thought of those records.
Yeah.
right? Because I've got records of people in Australia when we've done Australia, right? I don't need them anymore. So we're going to purge that. So I think doing an audit on that as well is
Yeah.
probably a good idea.
And when we say purge, we're not saying, fully delete that information, but what you might want to do is a backup onto an external hard drive. So maybe you tuck it in a safe, or you put this external hard drive somewhere where you're not ever fully getting rid of it, but you're cleaning it off the system that you're working on a day to day, where, heaven forbid, some hacker gets in, or it can be caused by employee mistakes. That's the other thing where cyber insurance it does cover is employee error. So if someone accidentally releases personal information, and again, you're facing a lawsuit or you have to send out notification to people who've been affected, that's where cyber liability is really important to have.
And also, one thing I wasn't conscious of until I became conscious of it is especially this year with all the travel that we've been doing. Like I'll never log into a bank account or anything like that when I'm traveling. I just don't take the risk.
Good
But just
practice.
connect yeah, but just connecting with a public network exposes you,
Oh, does it
right?
ever? Yep.
We don't think of that, right? So
It's
the
so true.
VPN kicks in, and then I found it really frustrating because the VPN would block something. And I was like, damn, I need to get this work done. And but those precautions are there to protect us, right?
Definitely. And while I'm not a tech expert, Suki, what I could recommend, what I've been doing is when I'm at the airport or if I'm in some public realm, I'm just going to use the hotspot on my
Yeah,
phone.
that's what
Because that, I mean, especially if you're using, an Apple device, like the encryption level on those is bar none. And so you're really better suited to just hotspot tether onto your phone and use that versus the public Wi-Fi that's
you're right.
available.
Because when we're in India, so the VPN on my system, for some reason, when I was in my room, no problem. VPN was
Hmm.
great. This is secure. You can connect. But when I was in the lobby, no matter what, I it would not let me. And that's what I ended up doing. I just shut the thing down,
Yeah,
hotspot, done. Um,
good.
I do want to talk about employees and misclassification.
Great. I
Where
love
do you
this
would
topic. It's so good.
let's
I
start.
hate I hate it and I love it. I hate it because it is a very real risk. And I will say this is actually where we see a majority of our insurance claims is around misclassification. But I love it because it's such an important risk that is in our industry that we need to talk about. So I'm so glad we're here to do
Yeah,
so.
because my simple mind looks at it and say, why are you even taking a risk? It is,
Yeah.
classification, and you may tell me different, is very easy. The law says if you are this, you are an employee. If you're this, contractor, right? You can be a contractor. So let's
Hmm.
talk about, yeah, I see it all the time. I have these conversations. I'm like, that's not a contractor.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of temp people saying, talking about, oh, no, no, no. So they contractor here. And like, I'm no expert on this, right? So let's clear this up because arguably that could be the biggest risk to your business because you mess that one up, you're going to get maybe not be shut down, but the fines are going to be so damaging you may want to shut down.
Fines,
Yeah.
reputation, having to hire a lawyer to defend you, like it has the possibility to potentially do a business in. And I don't say that lightly. Like I've seen these claims, I see the damages, I've seen the fines, and it's a very real risk. And so I think, let's talk a moment for employee contractor because really, I think they're either some folks are really understanding of what these classifications are. Some people are very up in the know around what the definitions are per the Employment Standards Act. But I think really you're looking at three main classes of workers. You've got your typical T4 employee, who their employer, be it the staffing company, be it for me, ProLink Insurance is my employer, where they're responsible for all my deductions. They have a duty of care for me as I have a duty of care for them. I'm working on behalf of my employer. And so that one is, I think, is pretty well known about who constitutes as an employee. When we get into contractors, we've got two sort of classifications. We've got your true independent contractor, and then we've got a dependent contractor. And finding the distinguishment between those two can be kind of difficult.
Okay,
And
so what is
so
it?
yeah, so really, the distinguishing factor between who is dependent and who is independent really falls down to a few items. One being how reliant is that contractor on a customer or a client or an employer? So if they're considered a contractor, but they've been working for this company for 3 years over, they are taking their direction from that individual, all their tools and resources are provided to them by that company, it could very easily be argued they're a dependent contractor or
Okay.
potentially an employee. Whereas an independent contractor, generally there's a few things that really identify them as being independent. One is they've gone out and incorporated themselves. So they are, for all intents and purposes, running their own business. They have a unique skill set that puts them in a position to effectively start a business that uses their professional services as their service offering.
An
And so
accountant, for example.
yeah, an accountant, an IT consultant, project manager. They usually have their own tools and resources because they could be jumping from gig to gig to gig. And that device or those tools really allow them to be able to effectively do their business. And so I think when you're looking at it from the classification standpoint, you're meeting with a candidate who is undecided or is not knowing enough about, should I be considered an employee? Should I be considered an independent contractor? It's not unusual. They're going to look to you as the recruiter, as the person who is, essentially looking to hire them and put them out to assignment. They're going to look to you for a bit of that advice and guidance on what is truly appropriate. And it really, that falls back to professional liability. We're giving our professional advice, therefore we should be in the know about what those classifications look like and what are the risks involved.
That all makes sense to me because, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you've got a true independent, if you're a true independent contractor, they're controlling their own hours and all of that kind of stuff, right? A temp is not an independent contractor. And I'm hearing a lot of people saying, yes, that is possible. Let's kill that one once and for all. Tell people why a temp, minimum wage, $20 an hour, let's even go $25 an hour, um, cannot be classified as a independent contractor.
Yeah. So even though there's nothing legally, and I'm not a lawyer, there's my
Yep.
little disclaimer. I haven't seen anything legally that says, for X amount of dollars hourly wage, you should or you have to be qualified as an employee. Really, from a risk management lens and for a general, you know, good practice standpoint, you wouldn't want to onboard someone who is in, the $25 an hour or less per, wage. You wouldn't want to put them necessarily as an independent contractor because they're likely not making enough to effectively manage themselves from a tax perspective. I think the cost of going out and having to incorporate themselves, which again is a major sort of determination of who could be an independent contractor, you're putting a lot of responsibility and a lot of risk onto your candidate when you're encouraging them to become an independent contractor when they are working a job that isn't commanding a huge pay rate, and that individual may not have a very unique skill set that they can carry over from place to place to place on a gig work, if you know what I mean.
Yep. So just on that note, I did try and get some clarity around this one, around the whole One Bill 27 and what have you. Now, I was talking to Mike Lacey, President NACCB. I think I got that right. And he said that there's no official number, like hourly rate, but he said kind of that agreed gentleman's handshake kind of number was
Yeah.
$60,
Yep.
right? Was
Yeah, and that's
$60
and
an
that's the
hour.
same. Yeah, and that's the kind of the same range. I say 60 to 65 is kind of your range when really, having that conversation with someone around, because there are benefits to being an independent contractor, don't get me wrong. That's when it's worth having that conversation around how do you want to set yourself up here? You've come to the table with a unique skill set, and that's reflected in the hourly wage. How do you want to go from here? And there's a lot of valuable resources. There's a lot of people who can help effectively guide that individual on, incorporating themselves, educating them on the tax and accounting that goes along with that. And it's really just having your business and having your recruiters have that network available to show them or guide them on how to effectively set yourselves up. But again, going back to, classifying someone who's making a lower hourly wage, they're kind of relying on you to be their conduit to make sure that they're properly being cared for, and that means being, as an employer, making sure their deductions for EI, CPP, and all that are effectively taken care of. Um, that's a big burden off of them, and we want to make sure that our workers, our candidates, feel emboldened and empowered, and that they're making the right decision with partnering with your organization. And having those conversations around classification is a really great way to bolster your organization's knowledge on that.
But I think also, and this granted, this applies to Ontario. If you look at all the bills that are coming out,
Hmm.
it's protecting vulnerable workers.
Yeah.
And I'm coming back to the temp, trying to classify a temp as an independent contractor. A lot of these are vulnerable workers, and there's a huge description. But let's just say immigrants for now, for just for clarity for what I'm about to say. They don't know what they don't know. So they may go and do this, go and do that, and just thinking that's how things work here. Now, suddenly there's this whole liability on them that they didn't even know,
Totally.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, that's the thing is we think of the reputational harm that your business could face as a result of that becoming public knowledge. And, it really it in my opinion, I think it puts not only your organization in a bad light, but it can also put the industry in a bad light too. And I think that was also part of, this whole idea of creating the licensing was really to help create, an ethical framework for staffing companies, temporary help agencies, and recruiters to make sure that they're not taking advantage of these vulnerable workers. And I think part of that is making sure that they're classified properly.
I think neither of us are lawyers, but whilst it might not be illegal, I do
Hmm.
think it's unethical,
I
right?
agree.
I think just from a alignment perspective, now if you think about it, your clients, right? So wherever you're sending them, they don't want the workers quote unquote exploited like that, right? Because it's going to come back on them as well because, oh, but I was a temp at company X,
Yes, you're
right?
right.
So there's that whole part to it. So and I personally think it's a question of when it becomes illegal, not if it becomes illegal. If you
Yeah,
just look at the legislation that's happening, and I'm all for this one, it is, the whole legislation was designed around protecting vulnerable workers, and they don't know what they don't know. So if they
yeah,
come from England, it's a different story because we have a very similar um, laws and things like that, and we have PAYE and what have you. But if they come from, I don't know, India, Middle East, China, where they don't have that system,
right.
they don't know what they don't know.
Exactly. And again, that puts your organization into a very precarious spot
Yeah.
because they don't know what they don't know until they know.
Yeah. Fair
And they
point.
come back and say, "What were you doing? What
Yeah.
were you doing?" And as a result of what you were doing, I'm now in this position and I could potentially sue you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that this is a really hot topic. I don't think it gets enough conversation, but it really is. It's a really fundamental practice on how staffing companies run their business.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter. I mean, all this misclassification, fair point, we're talking if you're temp contracting and stuff like that. But even if you're retained, the liability is still there for everything else we've talked about,
Yeah.
right? Your data, your professional. Okay, fair enough. This misclassification piece won't apply to you because you're pure retained, or even if you're uh, direct hire, but all the other stuff still applies. We're coming up to time, and you and I could talk forever on the. What's your final passing comment then? So people are listening to this, doesn't matter where in the world they are, because it's all applicable, may have slight variance. What are your final thoughts? What are you saying to that person, especially that person that hasn't even done an audit recently?
Yeah. Well, audits, I mean, I live for a good audit. I love them. So, yeah, I think having a robust audit procedure in place when for all your recruiters to have at their desk when they are engaging with new candidates is to essentially go through, and it just needs to be a very simple yes no questionnaire to really identify who is your candidate and are they or should they be considered an employee versus an independent contractor based on, what the ESA says, but also on general good practices? So I think having a good, robust audit procedure is a really good thing to have. The other thing I'll leave you with too is I mentioned this misclassification risk is probably the most exposed insurable risk that I see. However, all those policies we talked about at the very beginning, I want to leave all our listeners with one last really crucial insurance product that all staffing companies should be looking at is called employment practices liability insurance. That insurance is a very simple type of insurance, but very effective. And what it's intended to do is to cover your organization for claims that are made against you for any such allegations as wrongful dismissal, harassment, discrimination, retaliation, failure to promote, all of those types of things that can happen where an employee or an individual might feel they've been egreged by as a result of decisions that were made by management or whomever. And so making sure that you have an employment practices liability policy on our program here at ProLink, we have it included within the professional liability, but making sure that your business has an employment practices liability policy that not only covers your internal employees, because let's not forget, if you're running a business, your own internal employees
Yep.
may come to you with these such actions, but making sure that it extends to cover your workers on assignment. I can't tell you, Suki, how many times I've used that exact line for 10 plus years that I've been working exclusively with staffing companies. Making sure your employment practices policy will cover claims that are made by your workers on assignment. So I want to leave that with our listeners. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with anyone who's really interested in this topic because I love it. And I think, yeah, that would probably be one of the major takeaways today from me.
Okay, so I was going to end with I'm a business, staffing business. I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I'm covered, or ooh,
Uh-huh.
how do they get hold of you and say, okay, this is what I've got. What am
Yeah.
I missing, or what? Or help you. How can you help them do the audit, right? So how can they get hold of you?
Great. So they can get a hold of me a few different ways. Firstly, you can easily find me on LinkedIn and feel free to send me a message there. My phone number, my direct line is 416 644 7736. So I'll repeat that, 416 644 7736. And my email is Matthew with two T's, MATTHEWC at ProLink.insure, INSURE.
Amazing. They're going to find you. And if they can't find you through that, get in touch with me.
They can find
I
you.
can I can connect you. And you're also a partner with the Recruitment Professionals Forum. So that's another way
Proudly.
they can get. And yeah, it's all about elevating our industry, right? And supporting
Indeed.
each other. So fantastic. Matt, thanks ever so much for your time. This has been really, really helpful. And I am going to chat to you later.
Thanks, Suki.
Thanks
Take
for your
care.
time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Talent Titans, brought to you by Recruitment Professional Forum, where they're building a grassroots community for professionals and leaders in the recruitment industry to collaborate, advocate, and advance the profession. If you liked or were inspired by what you heard, make sure to follow, subscribe, and even leave a review. It lets more talented recruiters like you find the show. Until next time, keep on being a talent titan.